You're listening to Radio VR from London. I'm Scott Craig. To say that Britain is in the grip of a housing crisis is something of an understatement. First, there's the cost. Housing now eats up around 20% of the average family's earnings, a figure that can be substantially higher here in the capital. And with house prices and rents rising fast, compared to fairly stagnant wage rises, that trend looks set to continue. But it all comes back to supply. Too few homes are being built. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation says it believes Britain could face a shortage of over 1 million homes by 2022, unless the rate of house building increases substantially. The figures are disputed, but everyone agrees that as a nation, we're simply not building enough homes. So the news announced by Chancellor George Osborne that the government is to build 15,000 homes in a development at Ebbsfleet as part of a so-called garden city should have come as welcome news. Instead, it's provoked a heated debate, not only about Britain's housing crisis, but about competing visions of how we live and what kinds of communities and spaces we should be creating. I'm joined in the studio here by William Cook, a journalist and author. Andrew Black is associate at PRP Architects. And by Skype, Ben Harris-Quinney is chairman of the Bow Group, a conservative think tank. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. I think before we proceed with this, we are an international network. A garden city sounds like the most English of English things. Andrew, maybe you could help our audience out a little bit. What is a garden city?
Well, the whole idea of garden cities started about 100 years ago, just over 100 years ago. A architect and a visionary, Ebenezer Howard, decided that Victorian dwellings, Victorian housing wasn't really fit for purpose. So decided that the solution to this was to build new garden cities across the UK. And the two main ones that are the most well-known are Letchworth Garden City and Welwyn Garden City. And that was brought about by a new legislation, new towns coming in, and this whole vision of garden cities were pulled together. And there was various visions and principles about those, about them being for the community, about there being long-term stewardness of the assets, about there being big jobs there available, but it's all about it being a social city in the first place, about there being open space and really getting away from that feeling of overcrowding that existed in the Victorian era.
It's a kind of socialist idea.
It was, and a lot of the first garden cities were brought about by socialists, by people that were very altruistic, that wanted to look after their workers. So you had things like Bourneville, where they were specifically built for the workers of that industry and revolving around giving them better housing and better living conditions.
William, what does the term mean to you? You actually live in Ruislip, I believe.
Yes, I do. I live in a place that's called Metroland because it was a kind of garden city Mark II, I guess, where they built the train lines. Rather than building train lines to serve communities that were already there, they almost built them to create communities. They built these train lines out of London into the surrounding countryside and sort of created suburbia all around London. I love the original garden city concept, but I fear that it's become a bit of a euphemism and it's become a bit of a polite word for something that's not quite as good now as what it used to be. Andrew's absolutely right. When these garden cities were designed, they were very sort of high quality in terms of the concept. But in what's happened in the subsequent 100 years is that cheaper and cheaper versions of them have been made. The original garden cities have splurged out of all proportion to the original ideas, and unfortunately my feeling is that if you put a garden city down somewhere, it's a lovely idea, but then the thing kind of grows and grows and grows, partly because of motor cars, which weren't even around when these garden cities were invented, and you end up with something which is a long way away from Sir Ebenezer Howard's original vision.
Ben Harris-Quinney, what does the term mean to you? Is the idea something which you would support in principle? Is it valid?
It is, and actually I happen to live in Hertfordshire, roughly equidistant between Letchworth and Welwyn, and the towns themselves, I think, are a testament to the project today. In Hertfordshire, we also have Stevenage and Harlow, or Harlow's just outside in Essex, and these are towns that were built just after the Second World War and perhaps less of urban paradises than the garden cities of Welwyn and Hatfield. So, Welwyn and Letchworth. And so Hertfordshire offers, quite a good comparison in constructing new towns and what works and what doesn't. But fundamentally, this project in Ebbsfleet is very interesting. I don't see any reason why not to do it. It's an interesting pilot scheme. Of course, it's only 15,000 houses, and the housing crisis in the United Kingdom is far more deep-rooted and far more severe than can be solved by the construction of 15,000 houses. So we need to look at this at a much more national scale, and I don't believe that the current government has actually begun to do that, although clearly there are steps being taken towards a solution, but no solution on the table as yet to the overall problem.
Andrew, there's an important point there, isn't it? I mean, this announcement of 15,000 homes, etc., is being trumpeted as a highly relevant thing for the housing crisis, but it is only 15,000 homes.
I think that any announcement and any push to increase housing supply should be welcomed, but one of our concerns was that the whole area surrounding Ebbsfleet was already designated for housing. A lot of that already has the benefit of planning permission, and it's there for the taking. And our concern is slightly that the whole Ebbsfleet was rebranded as a garden city, but what will actually get delivered there is probably not in line with how you would imagine a garden city to be. And I think there is clearly a big gulf between housing need in this country and housing supply. And only so much of that can be met through brownfield development and through minor infilling on greenbelt sites on the edge of cities. Something else needs to happen.
And Ebbsfleet, of course, is on a high-speed rail line. It's almost, in that sense, the opposite of what you would expect from a garden city, which is supposed to be a self-sustaining community where people not only live, but they work, and it's a community. This is essentially a suburb.
That's correct. And there is a danger, not necessarily a danger, but there's a thought that Ebbsfleet is merely there to feed the beast that is London. It's growing. And housing need in this country, whilst London and the South East represents a huge amount of that, there is housing need elsewhere in the country, and that needs to be met. And there's been a bit of criticism to say, well, a lot of the focus is shifting towards London and the South East, but it needs to go wider in that.
William, what is it like to actually live in the community you live in?
Well, I think there are still beautiful parts of it, but I think the one thing that has happened to the whole garden city concept in the last 100 years has been the motor car, and motor cars have had a terrible effect. I mean, we all use them, none of us can live without them, but they have had a terrible effect on our planned spaces. For instance, Ben was talking about Stevenage before. I've had a lot of happy times in Stevenage. I go there with my son, he plays football there and so on, but it is almost impossible to walk around this place. It is cut apart by roads and roundabouts, and if you're actually trying to get around this place as a pedestrian, you feel like an ant. The only part of Stevenage that actually works for pedestrians is the tiny part of it that was built about 300 years ago. It's the little kind of Georgian enclave in the middle of it. So I think after 100 years, we still haven't come to terms with what cars are doing to the spaces that we live in, and it's getting worse and worse. And I think in a way using the term garden city is a little bit cynical. I mean, it's a lovely term, but it's a bit like me knocking up a bit of MDF and calling it a Bauhaus piece of furniture. There's no kind of quality control over what is and what isn't a garden city, and I fear this is a very highfalutin term for something that is just going to turn into lots and lots and lots and lots of roads and cars.
You did write in your recent piece in The Spectator that moving to Metroland is the kind of compromise that comes with middle age. What did you mean by that?
Well, it means that I'm middle-aged for a start. But, but I mean, I guess what it means is it's what Andrew was touching on before, that these communities were originally envisaged as being quite self-contained, but over time they have, through one way or another, become commuter hubs, and even people living in Letchworth or in Stevenage or in Welwyn, lots of those people are travelling in and out of London, which wasn't really the original concept. And, I'm a commuter myself, and I commuted here today, but I'm not really doing what Metroland... Well, I'm doing what Metroland was designed for, because that always was a suburban belt, but not really what a garden city was designed for.
Ben Harris-Quinney, what about the politics of all of this? Is it odd that you have George Osborne, the most conservative of conservative chancellors, advocating what's basically a socialist concept in an area that is basically a conservative heartland? Are the politics of this odd?
What I think is important about Ebbsfleet is that it's being used as a model. And it's being used as a public-private partnership model. So the government's actually only putting in £200 million, which may sound like a lot, but it's only actually £4,000 per house. So it's not really socialism at all. This is government in partnership with development companies. And I think if Ebbsfleet works, then it's likely that we'll see more of these models being rolled out across the country. The problem is there really time to build Ebbsfleet, see if it works, and then roll the project out? I think actually it's more urgent than that, and an overall national plan is required.
Is that part of the problem, Andrew, that in this country, not just now, but really over decades, we have lacked that kind of coherent national plan about how we manage housing in this country, and that's, in a sense, why we're now in the position that we're in?
I think that's partly the case. I think that it's interesting because when the Conservatives, before they came in, they announced they wanted to abolish this whole idea of top-down approach to planning, to housing delivery, and they abolished this regional layer of planning in this country, the regional spatial strategies, and ended that top-down approach.
It was all about localism.
It's all about localism, and it's interesting that in many ways, when you're looking to how garden cities would be rolled out across the country, it's difficult to envisage localism making that happen. You will need something that will come down, top-down approach, an urban development corporation of some sort that would deliver those towns, designate the areas, buy the land, and deliver the infrastructure. And what doesn't quite add up for me is that we're now in a time, or supposed to be in a time, of localism, and how does that get delivered? How do these new cities, how do we increase the housing supply sufficiently without returning to top-down housing targets again?
William, do you feel like you are living in a different kind of community?
Well, yes, I do. I mean, it's rather surreal, really. I mean, it's one of these places that switches between rural and urban every time you turn the corner, and it's still an area 80 or 90 years after it was built that can't quite decide what it's doing. I think there's a kind of broader point here, and this is a discussion that's really very much about the English, because I think the thing is with the English that's very different from our continental cousins. We've never been comfortable being urban. Our dream of our ideal home is very rarely an urban home. You get people who live in Paris or Berlin, they're happy to live in the same apartment for 50 years, rent their apartment for 50 years, go down to the corner shop, go down to the corner cafe. They're fine living in an urban environment. You talk to any English person, almost any English person, and their fantasy home is very rarely an apartment in a city street. Even if they're living there now and having a great time in the middle of London, their dream is eventually they're going to live in the countryside, in this beautiful, bucolic country home. The garden city idea kind of buys into that dream, and it is a fantasy, it's a myth. The bottom line is if you build lots and lots of houses in a greenfield site, you are going to end up with some kind of urban environment, and what you're going to end up with is a city. It's not a garden. It's not a garden city. So it may be a good idea, but you're not going to end up with what Sir Ebenezer Howard had in mind.
Our attitudes as a nation towards housing along the lines that you just described there, and the old thing, the Englishman's home is his castle and all that, are our attitudes to housing changing with new generations coming who are not going to necessarily be able to afford to have the same relationship with housing and property?
Well, I think you're right. I think it's always been a fantasy. I mean, this idea of the country cottage has never been real for most people, but it's something that a lot of people cling to, and you see it in our kind of suburban architecture and our suburban design, and the mock Tudor houses are all part of that kind of myth. But I agree with you. I think now the younger generation, younger than me, is waking up to the fact that it's completely unobtainable. Not that they're going to get it one day maybe, but that they're never going to get it at all. But it's a funny one. I still think people who, the younger generation come up, they still have this slightly sentimental, nostalgic idea of home that really doesn't exist in other continental countries, and is one that we really can't afford. We can't afford it anymore.
I just want to throw something else out there as well. Are we starting from a false premise, as it were? Writing in The Guardian, Natalie Elphick says she doesn't really believe the numbers. The housing sector is exaggerating the extent of housing need, and she attacks what she calls the vested interests of the social housing sector. Ben, is that something you would agree with? Is it becoming an increasingly politicized issue? Are we looking at this in the wrong way?
It depends where in the country you're talking about. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that there's a huge demand for housing in the southeast and certainly in London. I think in the rest of the country, it's more questionable. I mean, it was mentioned that maybe there's some other sites for new towns and for garden cities that won't be in the London commuter belt, but I wonder if there is as much demand there. And I think, okay, I take the point that people like to spread out and move out to the countryside when they start a family. But what we're actually seeing at the moment is a huge trend towards urbanization in the United Kingdom and throughout the world. And in the United Kingdom's case, that urbanization is really specifically centered around London. And so the fact is, we need more homes, more accommodation in and around London. So I think that demand is real, and especially for the younger generation, especially for the under 30s and the generations that will follow. I don't see that trend changing. So that demand is going to remain high. In the rest of the country, I think it will be interesting. I mean, of course, HS2 is really being lauded as a project that's going to bring that sort of demand and prosperity to the rest of the country. Whether it does or not, I'm not so sure.
Planning is a big part of this. Andrew, is the planning regime in this country simply up to the job of planning the communities of tomorrow?
I think there has been significant changes, positive changes in the planning system in this country with the income of the NPPF, which rationalises our planning process and really encourages house building to take place across the country. And
NPPF
is the National Planning Policy Framework, which the Conservatives brought in to rationalise a whole host of very complicated planning guidance to quite a simple document, easy to use, that's very focused on housing delivery. I think one of the key things, though, whether it's garden cities or whatever happens in this country, is to enable communities to benefit from new development that happens and to internalise the benefits that come with that, with infrastructure, with new homes bonus, with council tax increase, with business rates. And it's enabling local communities to see that in allowing development to happen, in voting for development to happen, that there will be significant improvements, significant benefits that community will bring to it. And I think that's lacking in our current thinking and the current way that the planning system works. And it makes it very difficult for communities to link those two together. And I think that's where the changes need to take place.
Do we lack vision in Britain?
I think we lack the long-term vision to see where housing's going. And I think there's a risk with Ebbsfleet, with other things, that we're building housing that we think is needed, and it's building housing that has been built for the last 30 years. It's not changed a great deal. And what we know that in this country, it's not unique to London. Across the country, we have a growing population. Huge issues are existing with older people's housing, with older people's accommodation, and with the healthcare that goes with that. And really, the development industry hasn't yet caught up with that. And how do we build cities and build settlements and communities that enable us to obviously cope with all the infrastructure requirements, but enable people to live there for longer. People are living longer these days, and to put less stress on hospitals by building the housing that's really needed for older people. And that's a key thing.
William, on this question of vision, we've talked a lot, obviously, about a crisis, there aren't enough homes, etc. That, in a sense, though, isn't it? It's an opportunity to reimagine what a community in the future is going to look like. Are we missing that vision?
Well, what I worry about with visions is that it's a very top-down idea. And in places like Stevenage, you see places that have been created. And actually, the places that people like to go and live and go and spend their free time are organic places that have evolved. Our older towns and cities are places that grew up over hundreds of years, and all the different interactions between people in those cities and towns is what makes them interesting. If something's drawn up on a big plan and then plonked down in the middle of the countryside, I wonder if it's ever going to have the same appeal. I mean, two things concern me, really. One is the original Garden City idea was low density and high cost. Now, if this is what's going to be built in Ebbsfleet, I'll be delighted, but I'll be very surprised if it matches up to that original model. And the second concern is all the beautiful cities in the world are constrained by geography. If you think of Manhattan or Venice, these are places that are squeezed by the surrounding geography, and that's what makes them special. I mean, what's happened with garden cities, regrettably, is they have created a kind of sprawl around them. And I fear that all the way along the HS2, there is going to be this kind of sprawl.
Ben, HS2 is just going to export this sprawl across the country. Is that a risk in your view?
I think that would be a success of HS2 if it does bring increased investment and prosperity to the north. I don't think we can afford to be. I mean, of course, it would be lovely if every town in the United Kingdom was exquisitely beautiful, but I think it's actually more important that we meet the needs of the hugely swelling population that is going to be evident in the United Kingdom over the next 50 years, and that hopefully some of that investment and growth comes to the north and to the Midlands rather than just around London, because I think London's a fantastic city, but there is an element of in the United Kingdom we sort of put all our eggs in one basket. It's very unusual for a country of our size to really have no second city that can compete with London in any way, shape or form. So if that happens as a result of HS2, if Birmingham grows, if Manchester grows, and if along the route of HS2 there are new towns and new developments, I think that would be a very positive thing. I mean, one of the strange things about this is you mentioned opportunity for vision. There's also opportunity for a huge amount of investment and a huge amount of money to be made on the part of the of property developers. So it should be a win-win. It's just a case of getting the model right, and making sure that local as well as national needs are met. Obviously, that's difficult, but is
that what we really want, though? Do we really want all parts of the United Kingdom to essentially look the same? If you go from one town in this country to another, they all fairly much look the same. They have the same shops, they have the same chain restaurants, etc. And isn't this model of the garden city actually not a garden city at all? It's just the next evolution in the over-consumerization, if you like, of formerly rural areas.
Well, that's a different problem. I think in terms of all the shops and all the restaurants looking the same, that's a facet of globalization. I don't, whatever town you build, you're not going to be able to construct new companies that are going to fill the vacant shops and offices. So, that is a reality that is part of modern Britain. It may change, it may not. I don't think there's much you can do in terms of building new developments around that, but you can, I think, incorporate innovative design with local character, and I'm a believer in localism. But I think what local councils want to see, and what regional councils want to see is real incentive being put their way. Evidence of investment and infrastructure coming their way, rather than just getting 30,000 new homes and putting a huge strain on their resources. So it's that's the hump we've got to get over in the United Kingdom, is getting over the hump of selling the idea to towns and villages and cities up and down the country that more homes, more investment, more infrastructure growth is a good thing.
Andrew, you were an associate at PRP Architects. As such, from a building and a design perspective, what do you want to see coming out of this next generation of communities and homes in this country?
In terms of design, it's very important that we pick up local character of areas and that we use local materials and respond to that. But more importantly, in the housing that we build, and we build, it's very important that we have flexibility. The way that we're living in houses now has changed massively since 100 years ago. People working from home, different types of families in there, single parents, people are frequently now having parents come back to live with them as they're older. There's a lot of demands are placed on homes now, and we need to not be building the homes that we were 50 years ago. We need to be evolving the design, evolving the flexibility, and looking at innovative ways of energy within our homes. Energy use is very important. The way that we use all sorts of heating and cooling, and that all has to come into the homes that we build. And we've got to make sure that in terms of our longer term vision in this country, that we're looking to build a very innovative product in our houses.
William, the homes of tomorrow?
Well, yes, it's a mystery, and I don't think any of us quite know where we're going with this. I mean, I think the paradox for English people is increasingly, as Ben was saying, increasingly we're living in cities, but we still have this imagination of the English countryside. We're still rural at heart, and our heads are in the city. And I live on the green edge of London, and that green edge is under enormous pressure to build new houses, and most of that building is very, very ordinary and anonymous and rather depressing. And you see these ancient hedgerows being covered in concrete and crazy paving, and they're never going to be hedgerows again. And it is where a lot of our culture is from. Maybe we're waving goodbye to that. Maybe it's on its way out. I don't see a solution to the problem necessarily, but I do think we're in a time of tremendous change, and we are going to maybe lose a lot of things that we consider to be intrinsic to the idea of being English.
But is that in itself kind of part of English identity? I say that as a non-Englishman myself, but I mean, looking at the English from the outside, it is this kind of mishmash of ideals and you know, traditions and modernity all kind of jumbled up.
Well, I think you're right. I think we're an incredibly nostalgic nation, and it's what's good about and also, us and what's also infuriating about us. I mean, just about the only purely English art movement was the pre-Raphaelites, and these were people who were living in Victorian times in modern houses with central heating, and were creating this fantasy vision of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. So there you have it, I guess. We're always looking back. Things were always better before. And they probably were.
Ben, let me just come back to you quickly as well. Not looking back, looking forward, what is the future and what, in your view, needs to be done to tackle the housing crisis?
First of all, I mean, we have a housing crisis because there are not enough homes to go around. So part of the process has to be thinking about exactly what our population is going to be over the next, half century, and you know, really looking at immigration through those eyes as well, because if the population exponentially continues to grow in the way it has in the last 50 years, there will always be a housing crisis. You know, we'll never be able to build enough homes. But I would hope the future will empower local communities to be able to really put their own mark on what they want in terms of development, and incentivize them to, or at least present the incentive to accept growth and to accept an enlargement of their community. As I say, in the way in the United States that, you know, if a town goes from 10,000 people to 50,000 people and 100,000 people and becomes a city, that's seen as a great success.
Andrew, I just wanted to come to you briefly as well. If there were one or two things that actually we could do to tackle this, what, in your view, are the most important things we need to do?
In the future, I think that we really need to look at how our cities work. I think one of the important things, if we're expanding any settlement, if we're building new settlements, it's not just about housing. Housing is an important part of it, but it's also about providing jobs for people. And we need to look at, we're not just providing places that are going to be dormitory towns where you can commute into London where the jobs are. It's about creating the opportunities for jobs where people live, and that's really important.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid there we must leave it. We're out of time. But my thanks today to my guests, William Cook, Andrew Black and Ben Harris-Quinney. You're listening to Radio VR from London. Stay with us.